So action potentials start when the first voltage-gated sodium ion channels open, but then other things happen that are part of the action potential. So a little summary of an action potential. At the start, the action potential is triggered by the axon hillock reaching threshold. From the beginning to the middle of the action potential, we have a wave of sodium that enters the axon. It begins at the axon hillock and it runs all the way down to the axon terminals. And this causes a depolarization along the axon cell membrane. From the middle to the end of the action potential, there's a wave of potassium ions that leave the axon. Right? Runs all the way down the axon to the axon terminals. And that causes repolarization. Okay? At the end of the action potentials, what's going to happen is the sodium-potassium exchange pump is going to return the sodium and potassium ions to their appropriate places, getting us back to resting membrane potential. So with an action potential, we start with the axon hillock reaching threshold, which will open the first voltage-gated sodium channel. Sodium ions enter the axon, causing a very dramatic depolarization. We go from -70 to +35 millivolts. Don't forget, action potentials are dramatic, big changes in voltage. That causes the second and subsequent voltage-gated sodium channels all along the axon to open. That's our domino effect. That's the action potential traveling. The voltage-gated sodium channels automatically close after 1 millisecond. So the first and then subsequent voltage-gated sodium channels will close after 1 millisecond. At about +35 millivolts, the first voltage-gated potassium channels open. So if you remember, -55 was the magical number we needed to be at to open our voltage-gated sodium channels. But +35 is the magical number we have to achieve in order to open our first voltage-gated potassium channels.
So at +35 millivolts, the first and then the rest of the voltage-gated potassium channels will open. And this is going to cause the areas around the voltage-gated sodium and voltage-gated potassium channels to repolarize, and then they kind of overdo it a bit and they hyperpolarize.
All right, so let's take a look at what's going on with these voltage-gated sodium and voltage-gated potassium channels during an action potential. So here we're starting off at rest. We're at -70 millivolts. Some sodium comes diffusing over to our axon hillock from an excitatory local potential, changing our axon hillock from -70 to -55 millivolts. -55 millivolts is the magical number we have to get to open our first voltage-gated sodium channel. Sodium rushes in, but notice it doesn't stay exactly right here. Some of it moves over here. We get to -20 millivolts. More sodium comes in. Right, so notice it's leaking further down. Right? Ooh, we are opening our second voltage-gated channel. Right, because we got to -55 here. Sodium's still coming in through our first one. We got sodium coming in through our second voltage-gated channel too. Right? We got all the way to +35 millivolts over here. It's about as high as it gets. Right? +35 millivolts is the voltage number that opens our first voltage-gated potassium channel. Potassium is going to leave the neuron, starting the repolarization process. Potassium continues to leave. We continue to repolarize. The repolarization goes a little overboard. We repolarize all the way to -90 millivolts. I want to take a quick peek at a graph for an action potential because I think this does help to illustrate some of the concepts involved here, especially with the voltage-gated ion channels. Right? So in the graph, as we go up, the voltage increases, and as we go across, time is progressing. Okay? So we start off at rest at -70 millivolts. Right? But then we open our first voltage-gated sodium channel at -55. That causes all of the other voltage-gated sodium channels to open. We get large inrush of sodium coming into the axon at about +35 millivolts. After 1 millisecond, most of the voltage-gated sodium channels are closed. At +35 millivolts, our first voltage-gated potassium channel opens. and then the second and subsequent voltage-gated potassium channels open, and that causes a decrease in the voltage because we're repolarizing as the potassium leaves. The voltage-gated potassium channels close really slowly, so they start closing at negative 70 millivolts, but they finish closing at negative 90 millivolts. So we hyperpolarize a little bit there at the end of the action potential. So here in this little animation, we are going to see the actions of the voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels. So the pink is the sodium ions and purple are the potassium ions. So the pink channels are the sodium channels, and then the purple channels are the potassium channels. So what happens first during an action potential is we're going to depolarize to negative 55 millivolts, right? That will open our voltage-gated sodium channels. The sodium follows its concentration gradient and it comes into the neuron. I'm going to speed this up a little bit. Okay. Once we get to plus 35 millivolts, our potassium channels open, potassium leaves. Don't forget that the sodium channels will automatically close after 1 millisecond, right? So this inactivation gate closed is showing you the sodium channels are closed after 1 millisecond. The potassium channels remain open until we get to about negative 70 millivolts, in which case they begin to close at negative 70 and finish closing at negative 90. Oops. This is just a series of pictures that show you the same thing as that video does, but it also includes a little graph down here, the same graph we looked at for the action potential. At rest, both the sodium and potassium channels are closed. Once we get to negative 55, the sodium channels open, sodium comes in, and we depolarize, which is going up on the graph. Right? At about plus 35, the sodium channels are closed, and the potassium channels open, the potassium leaves, causing the repolarization, the downward slope on the graph. Right? The potassium channels begin to close at negative 70 millivolts with a complete closing at negative 90. So the voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels, are they closed or open at rest? You said closed, you're correct. Voltage-gated sodium channels open once the voltage reaches negative 55 millivolts. When this happens, the channel allows sodium to do what? Enter or exit the axon. If you said enter, you're correct. Remember, most of the sodium is outside the neuron at rest, and the sodium comes in through the... yeah, no, I said that right. I was down on my phone. Let me start over again. All right, so on this particular slide, you have some options that you'll be choosing for answer choices. So let's take a look here. Voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels are what? Closed or open at rest? If you said closed, you're correct. Voltage-gated sodium channels open once the voltage reaches negative 55. Once we reach negative 55, the voltage-gated sodium channels open, allowing lots of sodium to do what? Enter or exit the axon. If you said enter, you're correct. Enough sodium enters to depolarize to plus 35 millivolts. Don't forget the sodium channels close after 1 millisecond. The potassium channels open when the voltage reaches plus 35 millivolts. Potassium then exits the axon. At around negative 70 millivolts, the potassium channels begin closing, and they finish closing at negative 90 millivolts. So a nice summary of what we've talked about. See if you can fill in these blanks here for a review on action potentials. What starts an action potential is an excitatory local potential. During excitatory local potentials, sodium enters the neuron at what parts of the neuron? If you said dendrites and cell body, you're correct. Sodium diffuses towards the blank of the neuron. Where does that sodium have to get to in order to initiate the action potential? If you said axon hillock, you're correct. So sodium diffuses towards the axon hillock of the neuron, where the first voltage-gated sodium channels are located. What do we need to do to open the first set of voltage-gated sodium channels? What's the magic number we have to get to? Right, it's negative 55. Once the first set of voltage-gated channels are open, all the voltage-gated ion channels on the axon open, causing that large moving change in the transmembrane potential, which is called the action potential. Take a minute and pause the video and see if you can put these in the correct order. What we're looking at here are pictures of the voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels. And see if you can put them in the correct order for the action potential. All right, so we start off at resting membrane potential, which is negative 70 millivolts. Both of our gated ion channels are closed. Next would be this one right here. We have our local potential that has occurred, and we depolarize to negative 60 millivolts. Next would be plus 10 millivolts. So between the negative 60 and the plus 10, we must have got to threshold negative 55, and that opened our voltage-gated sodium channels. Sodium comes in, keeps coming in until we get to about plus 30, plus 35 millivolts. The voltage-gated sodium channel closes after 1 millisecond. At around plus 30, plus 35 millivolts, the voltage-gated potassium channel is open. Potassium leaves. Potassium continues to leave all the way until negative 90 millivolts, which is when the potassium channels completely finish closing. What happens after the potassium channel finishes closing at negative 90 millivolts? Are we all done? We can go home? Well, at the end of the action potential, the sodium has come into the neuron and the potassium has left the neuron. Should we have sodium in the neuron when the neuron's at rest? And should we have potassium outside the neuron when the neuron is at rest? No. So the sodium and potassium, they're in the wrong places, right? So how can we fix this? How can we move sodium back out, potassium in? What magical thing in the cell membrane could possibly do this for us? You said the sodium-potassium exchange pump. You're right. So the sodium-potassium exchange pump is going to reorganize the sodium and the potassium. It's going to move 3 sodiums out for every 2 potassiums that come in, and we're going to end at our resting membrane potential of negative 70 millivolts.